Good morning, everyone. If you all could go ahead and take your seats, I'd appreciate it. We're going to get started on day 3 of Energy Week. It's been a remarkable couple of days. We're very glad that you're here today, and we're very excited about the speakers that we have. So a couple of housekeeping items for this morning as we start the day. The first is just a reminder to please silence your cell phones, tablets, anything that beeps. We want to make sure that we do that first. For questions, we are using an app called Slido. So I keep saying it's an app. You just put it into your browser, slido.com, and then you're able to put in a code, and that code is up on each of the slides that have the presenter, and you can insert the questions that you have for that particular speaker. We will be sending out a survey at the end of our event, and we're very interested in your feedback, so please do answer that survey. If you have specific comments or questions, you can also email us directly. It turns out that my email is in a number of different places, so you can certainly find a way to reach me. In terms of thanks, it's always good to start the day with thank you. A special thank you today to Amanda King, who has been running around behind the scenes and making a lot of the magic happen. So I wanted to make sure that we thanked Amanda King. In terms of sessions today, we are starting with Andrew Place, and I'm going to hold on talking about Andrew for a minute because we have a special introduction for Andrew. At 10:30, our English department is giving a presentation or having a panel discussion about the humanities and energy. For those of you who were here yesterday, you saw a dramatic monologue competition. We are very cross-disciplinary here at Carnegie Mellon, and so this is a very good way for us to sort of showcase that by having some areas outside of the typical ones that you would think about for energy. We will have lunch between 11:15 and 11:45, and then Chris White, who is the newly named CEO of Philips Lighting, will be presenting at 11:45. So on the agenda, it has lunch and Chris together because it is a lunchtime session. Chris will start promptly at 11:45, and I'll remind you of that when we get closer. At 12:30, we will have the official kickoff for the Allegheny Clean Tech University Prize Collegiate competition. During that point, we'll have 1-minute pitches from each of the teams. So it's an exciting time to see those teams, and they have worked very hard to prepare for this. We have tours scheduled between 1:30 and 3:30. We have a tour to Hazelwood Green, which is the 178-acre brownfield that's being redeveloped in the city of Pittsburgh. We have a walking hard hat tour of Tepper Quad. We still have a few spaces available in some of these, so make sure that if you're interested, you show up at the registration desk. We have another that's going to the Hilltop Urban Farm. Again, a couple of spaces still available. We want to make sure that that bus is full. And there's a walking tour of Scott Hall, including the nanotechnology laboratory. We'll be talking about that specifically. The pitches and part of the competition today are all being moderated by Jeanette Armstrong, who is the director of the Office of Technology Transitions for the U.S. Department of Energy. So she will be with us throughout the course of the day as we have the competition, the different segments of the competition. Between 3:30 and 5 o'clock, there's a student poster competition, and during breaks and lunch, you will actually see that many of the posters are already set up. There are 38 posters that are competing, and so many of you are actually serving as judges for that. So very excited about all of that student work. 38 posters is a lot of posters for us to judge today. At 5 o'clock, we'll have our 3 finalists from the day, from the Clean Tech competition, on stage to do 10-minute pitches, and then we'll make those announcements. At 6 o'clock this evening, we actually are partnering with Sustainability Weekend, and we will have a lecture from Balaji Ganapathy, who is with Tata Consultancy Services. He's the global HR and head of workforce. And then our final evening reception this evening will be also in partnership with Sustainability Weekend. So this morning, I'm very glad to present our speaker, as well as one of our best business partners from the city of Pittsburgh, Alex Pazuchanics. Alex is a CMU alum. He's also the Assistant Director of Mobility and Infrastructure for the City of Pittsburgh. He studied in the Hines College in Information Systems and Public Policy, and he currently serves as the Assistant Director of Mobility and Infrastructure for Mayor William Peduto in the City of Pittsburgh. He's also a board member of the Carnegie Library of Homestead. So, Alex.
Thank you, Anna. As Anna mentioned, I am the Assistant Director of the City of Pittsburgh's new Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. We have 2 charges in our name, brand new department as of a year ago. Mobility and infrastructure, how we move about our city and how we preserve those existing assets that we already have. And there's no 5 people in Pennsylvania who have more of an impact on the way that we do that and the innovation that comes along with that than the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission. There's a reason that the Commissioner Place and the other members of the commission were the cover models for the February issue of Public Utilities Fortnightly, which I swear to God is a real publication. I guess in this crowd you probably are all subscribers to it. The Pennsylvania Utilities Commission, both in terms of helping to see the transformation around traditional utilities like electric and natural gas, but also in the regulation and the balance between consumer and public interests in new technologies that didn't even exist 2 or 3 years ago, like 5G and ride sharing, which are things that we're intimately involved with in the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure. As of this month, the Pennsylvania Utilities Commission is embarking on new roles and responsibilities with the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority here in the city, yet again serving that key role in helping to balance the public interest and the interest of the utilities. So Commissioner Place is the vice chairman of the commission, beginning from his appointment on October 1st, 2015, was nominated by Governor Wolf. He was elected by his fellow commissioners to be vice chairman also in 2015. Prior to his appointment in the commission, he was the corporate director for energy and environmental policy here in Pittsburgh at EQT, and previous to that held a number of roles in the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, including Deputy Secretary for the Office of Energy Policy, Energy Technology Deployment. He's a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, as well as a fellow alumnus of the Hines College here at Carnegie Mellon University. Commissioner Place.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure, of course, to be here for many reasons. One, it's great to see Ed Rubin. And I teach a class now once a week. I come in on Mondays, and it gives me an excuse, if nothing else, to come back to Pittsburgh and come back to Carnegie Mellon, which I have huge respect for. And I think my son's going to come to school here next year. But that said, I think about, I would be remiss if I didn't note the strength of this university and the importance of the graduates and the work that's coming out of here in so many different departments. And I cross paths with CMU alums here, there, and everywhere, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. And the heft they bring to the issues, the technical expertise, and it's very true of my students. I'm not sure any are in the room at the moment, but the heft, the intellectual capability, the dedication, the diversity that comes through classes here and through the graduates that I run into. I couldn't ask for just a more fascinating place, and that I accidentally, by moving to Pittsburgh 30 years ago, one or another, found my way to CMU and remain connected in many different ways. Someone once said, and I'm sure it's a proverb that everyone knows, it's a cliche, but what said about maybe we live in interesting times. It's unfortunately, and for better or worse, very true. And I was thinking about the path I've taken over the last several weeks or months and days to get here. And I was in Mexico last week. I was in Harrisburg adjudicating cases yesterday. I'm here today. I'm in New Jersey on Sunday for the organization of PJM states, thinking about demand response and DER and all the issues floating around at FERC and PJM. Then on Tuesday, I'm in DC testifying at FERC on the arcana of aggregation, of how we aggregate demand response, storage, thinking about how all of that's coming in over the next years and decades. Those are really challenging issues. They're deep in the weeds, they're arcane, they're never going to hit the front page of anybody's paper, but they really do matter. And in the broader context of grid modernization, the technology that's coming in, how we're financing it, how we balance the obligations within the Commission of the utilities, ensuring that they remain viable, and making the investments that will put Pennsylvania in great stead this year and the years going out, but also how we balance that against the challenges of our residents and ratepayers. I wouldn't have, the governor's call to me was sort of a cold call if I'd served on the commission. I never imagined that I would. I was perfectly content working in the upstream oil and gas space. There was still a lot of work to do, thinking about risk, thinking about mitigating risk. But a friend of mine in graduate school said, I may not be the smartest guy on the planet, but I'm smart enough to know not to say no. And I thought about particularly, again, as I said, bring it back to that theme I mentioned about the complexity and the importance of this time we're in now, and particularly in Pennsylvania. And sort of more regionally, if you think about the PJM footprint, there is huge amount of effort being put into grid modernization, as I mentioned. How do we finance that? How do we ensure that we are investing in the right places? What does grid modernization mean? We're pulling out pipe. We have a DISC, accelerated recovery for pulling out natural gas pipe. Well needed for safety reasons. We have this aging infrastructure, and it's true across. The commission, we regulate everything from water, telecommunications, wireline, natural gas, electricity, Uber, Lyft, taxis, limousines, water, I mentioned water. Across all of that space, we're dealing with many of the same intractable and challenging issues that we have this overlay or underlay of a system that was built 50, 100 years ago, 20 years ago, for many cases of populations that were larger than they are today. We're dealing with a relatively static economy, and we're dealing with 1.3 million households, I think, in the Commonwealth are living within 1.5 times the federal poverty line. So how do we deal with all those issues that are often in contrast or in tension with one another? Those are the things that drove me to go to the commission. Again, the commission is deep in the weeds. It's never going to, hopefully it doesn't hit the pages of the paper, but what the commission does, how we regulate this, how we do it well or do it poorly, balancing all those needs, does have substantive impact on across the Commonwealth, or economic competitiveness and the suffering or lack of suffering of our residents. The other thing I was thinking about titling this chat was about all things FERC, all things PJM. In many ways, going to the commission, I thought, all right, I'm bounded in Pennsylvania. This is my mandate. This is what I'm obligated to think about. But increasingly, all the water coming over the transom, all the headwinds and the issues we're dealing with, so many of them come back to issues that we have a voice in at FERC or in PJM. First and foremost, thinking about, well, I can sort of work back chronologically, but First Energy's emergency application to DOE for essentially cost recovery, cost basis, rate basing of nuclear and coal generation. I understand where that comes from, and I understand the challenges they face. They're facing it from renewables. They're facing it primarily from natural gas. But how do we've bought into and we've accepted, and I think very rationally chosen to go down competitive markets. And if we are to essentially re-regulate natural gas, coal and nuclear, about 70% of PJM's generation mix, that will undoubtedly crater competitive markets. And you might argue that we need to do that. We need to rethink all this. But and I don't want to prejudge, but I will be filing comments on this issue. But I'm a firm believer in the benefits of what competitive markets have brought to us, and not negligent or oblivious to the impacts on big generators like First Energy, re-regulating coal and natural gas, or coal and nuclear, keep me speaking, would be a substantive challenge, I think, a very difficult and deleterious impact on the markets. But pulling back a little bit more onto the policy side of that, and I was at FERC this spring arguing for a price on carbon. I understand the pain of the nuclear side, particularly the nuclear side. We have 23 gigawatts of nuclear power in the Commonwealth. That's an important, that is a fundamentally important zero carbon resource. If that was to disappear en masse, or even in part, replacing that with renewables is a multi-decadal effort and an astoundingly expensive effort. So I understand the challenges of nuclear. I understand what natural gas has been eating their lunch, but am gravely concerned about the loss of nuclear power, particularly in the Commonwealth. But I am also interested in increasingly states, and if you look to the north, or states to the north, whether it's New York or New England, ISO, we have state policies, and I think perfectly valid state policies coming into our wholesale markets. So whether they're supporting, whether it's federal support or state support for energy generation, for solar, for wind, for storage, all of those pieces are coming in, and the states are justifiably saying, we want to have this is our obligation, this is our bailiwick to manage how we think about our mix and what we should be investing in as a society, as a Commonwealth, or in Pennsylvania's case. But the more you do that, the more you're bringing in subsidized units into a competitive market. And to date, I would argue that it's been small enough, it's been incremental enough that it hasn't done much substantive damage. People can feel free to disagree with me, and I think that's why we are discussing this. There is an argument that we are starting to see incremental but substantive damage to wholesale markets by how much of these resources are coming out of the market. And when you're looking out 5 years, 10 years, it's a tsunami. So, as I said, it's sort of trickling down from the north, but we also have an alternative energy portfolio standard here in the Commonwealth, and conversations about how that might be moving forward when it tops out in 2021. So it's fundamentally important to consider, are we distorting markets, energy or capacity markets? And what does that do to some of our important resources? For example, one of the nuclear concerns is that you can have negative energy prices at night from wind coming on, because they are making their money off the federal tax credits. And so they just get paid. They have an incentive to just generate. And what they're getting on the wholesale market is somewhat secondary to getting that federal tax credit. But then you've got a nuclear unit that's needed for the next day. It's July 6th. It's going to be extraordinarily hot, where PJM is a summer peaking resource market. So PJM is calling out, we need you on for tomorrow. But these are fairly inflexible units, nuclear and coal. So you've got to start ramping up the day before. But you're dispatching to a market with very low or negative prices. How does that work? To me, I get that pain. How we deal with that, and that's a big chunk of the conversations we're having within PJM, is price reformation. On the one hand, if you're sort of a purist, you can argue that the pain coming to nuclear and coal is from gas, and that there's nothing overtly wrong with using LMP as a market mechanism. It's worked well for 20 years. It's continuing with some tweaks to be a pretty good market. But there's a lot of pressure at PJM to rethink that and think about these questions about who's setting price in flexible units or flexible units, and how to deal with some of these market failures of negative pricing. But I would argue that rather than the tack that like Ohio has taken, or Connecticut, and the conversations around ZECs, I think that's a blunt instrument that it doesn't drive innovation. It's very difficult to get the price right. If you come up with a ZEC, how are you going to price it? So what I've been arguing at FERC, and what I argue within the Commonwealth here, is for a price on carbon, saying, all right, maybe we all don't want to think about pricing carbon because we think that climate change is a fundamentally important issue. But if you are going to have a market mechanism that can protect and remunerate low carbon sources like nuclear, put a price on carbon, put it in the energy market. That is a pretty nimble, transparent, clever way to do it, drives innovation. All operators can then say, all right, well, we've got this price of carbon. How do we innovate in our own space? Whether it's coal for CCS or driving efficiency, more efficiency on our gas plants. Then you have a price signal that is doing what it should do rather than this blunt instrument of a ZEC dropping in just to support a favored technology. The one other issue come in, we've had, we have all these different pieces coming in. As I mentioned, the DOE 202C issue coming out of First Energy. We have this question about state policies. But then, and we had the FERC DOE NOPR out of Scott Perry 2 or 3 months ago. There was sort of FERC kicked down the can down the road saying, yeah, we're not going to, again, rate base coal, but we want our ISOs to think about this question of resiliency that was raised in that by Secretary Perry. But it's not new to PJM. We've long been in conversations about resiliency and the value of some of these attributes that weren't historically valued. Again, it comes back to the complexity and modernization of of these markets. They're not just sort of monolithic, one attribute markets. And it used to be just move some electrons and hey, we have a market. But there are a lot of other attributes out there that we rationally should be pricing, but some are easier than others and some are quite difficult, and resiliency is one to properly price. But I'd argue that we need to. I think we can get there. I think it's complicated and challenging, and capacity constructs are already very difficult, artificial constructs, they're not true markets. And some of this lends more to that challenge that you already have in the capacity markets. But there is real rational reason to value resiliency. It's not 90 days of fuel, on-site fuel, which is what Secretary Perry was arguing. And he argued to backstop that. He looked back to the 2014 polar vortex and said, look, there was all this market failure because of lack of resiliency. And he argued that the 90 days of fuel, on-site fuel, would resolve that resiliency problem. But if you look at the numbers, it doesn't. It doesn't solve that problem. The polar vortex, very little of it was actually on the generation side, and coal actually had some challenges coming into the market. There were some frozen coal pile issues, but but additionally, if you look at where the real resiliency challenge is, it's in the distribution, transmission, but particularly the distribution end. And if you want to tackle resiliency, that's where you have to tackle it, and more broadly across the whole panoply, not simply by saying the 90 days of fuel make a difference. And I'm running short of time. There's a whole host of other things I wanted to mention. EV infrastructure, we're heavily involved with, alternative rate making, trying to think about what the utility of the future looks like, decoupling from the throughput of just the more electrons and the more molecules you move, that defends your revenue base. That's not a sustainable model, especially given the interests all of us have in energy efficiency and conservation. So giving more mechanisms for utilities to think about, to restructure what they are, what their business model is like, that's an ongoing issue. And just a brief one, Act 40, thinking about solar. Pennsylvania recently passed an in-state solar requirement, and that's in play. In the next 2 weeks, we'll see an implementation order come out on that, and that's a challenging space that I may or may not win on. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions.
Yeah, we actually have a lot of questions. We have about 3 minutes, so we'll get through some of them.
All right.
So first question, what policies does the Public Utility Commission have in its docket to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles?
Thanks. My office, Heavy Book, who's one of, I would argue, a real up-and-coming star, a young new member of my staff, chairs the infrastructure subcommittee on the state's efforts to think about EV implementation. How do we solve the chicken and the egg problem? And it's not so easy. And okay, we build a bunch of EV stations. Where do we build them? How fast do we build them? Who owns them? And there's an opportunity for utilities to own EV charging stations, or should we just carve it out just for third parties? Because we don't want to rate base something that like an EV charging station. Philosophically, I'm coming down to the middle, and I'm hoping we can find a way to thread the needle to say that there's an opportunity here for utilities to play in that space, but without foreclosing third parties, and I think it can be done, ownership. We start to trickle on, and it's another very prescient issue before us on ownership of generation. Historically, again, with the Competition Act, we said utilities are out of the generation business, but when I look at the future, I look at the present and the future, I don't think that model, that black and white, hard and fast silos, works very well. We've got all this DER out there, we've got storage, EVs, all of that space, how do we layer that in, and how do we think about hybrid models that allow better implementation and better adoption of many of these technologies?
Thanks. So I think we have time for maybe one more question, if we can make it quick. For students at the university, what do you think is the most important focus for future energy study?
To me, in some ways, it's an easy answer. Systems. You have to have all the particular pieces in place, but all of these challenges are just integration challenges. And I think of all the pieces, none of this is discrete. It's like the whack-a-mole problem. Every time I'm dealing with one issue, it bleeds into all others. It's grid modernization. I've talked about removing pipe, and that's also reducing methane emissions, and a critically important piece. But what the business structure looks like. So you need financially technical people, business technical people. You need the engineering that undergirds that. You need people who can really think broadly about tough choices and how we make these, how all of this works. And it's a mind-numbing sort of Gordian knot or plate of pasta when you try to deal with it. And you really can, as I said, deal with one piece discreetly. All of this sort of has to be brought together. And it's the same, I'll digress a little bit on the low-income issues, that we can't just deal with low-income issues within the commission. We got to think of housing and access and bringing a whole group of folks together and thinking about that. So we end up being something of a social service agency. So again, there's nothing that I do in my day-to-day work that doesn't cross across such a large spectrum, and getting folks that think in those ways and are creatively thinking about how to integrate all this as absolutely as fundamental as it can get for me.
Thanks, Andrew.
Sorry. Good.
Thank you, Andrew. And if we can take a second just for one more round of applause, thank you very much for those comments. So now my colleague, Amanda King, is actually going to tell us about our next group. I'm just going to get their slides up. Give me a second. Okay, next we have a panel titled The Imperative of Energy Humanities, where energy, engineering, and the arts intersect. And I'd like to introduce to you our professor, Kathy Newman. She's an associate professor of English at Carnegie Mellon University. She'll be moderating our panel today.
Good morning. I'm Kathy Newman. I'm faculty in the English department, and I'm going to introduce the panel. I think they're going to sit here, and we're going to take turns giving some short presentations. Jacob Gessling is a PhD candidate in literary and cultural studies. His research focuses on 20th and 21st century American culture and cultures of energy. In his dissertation, Jacob examines literary and visual art that represents or uses coal waste, such as slurry ash and acid mine drainage, to call attention to environmental conditions and the history of coal in Appalachia. Abigail E. Owen is a historian of science, technology, and environment. At CMU, she teaches history courses about the social and political aspects of water and agriculture, and a course called Introduction to Environmental Ideas for CMU's minor in environmental and sustainability studies. She is Director of Education for the Steinbrenner Institute for Environmental Education and Research at Carnegie Mellon University. Noah Thoralt is an assistant professor of anthropology in the CMU Department of History. He holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's conducted extensive ethnographic research in the Philippines. His scholarship and teaching combine the tools of history, anthropology, political ecology to ask how relationships with the environment are shaped both by uneven relations of power and by different ways of knowing, valuing, and being in the world. My work in the English department deals with labor, culture, material history. I'm finishing a book right now called How the 50s Worked, Mass Culture in the Decade the Unions Made, and I'm curating an art exhibit that opens today, marks at 200, art that considers the relationship between capitalism and culture, recognizing the fact that Karl Marx turns 200 in May of this year. So my presentation asks about the relationship between culture and energy. What is the history of how we have cooked our food, heated our living spaces, lit up our nights, and produced things that we can enjoy from a cultural point of view? As I've begun to work at the intersection of this nexus, culture and energy, I've become convinced that energy history must become an integral part of cultural studies. We can't make or enjoy culture without energy, and at the same time, the kinds of culture we produce and enjoy are dependent upon the available energy forms at a given moment. I want to start with this very old example. Archaeological evidence for the earliest evidence of cooking with fire has been traced to the Wonderwerk cave in South Africa nearly 1 million years ago. This means that for the first 996,000 years of human life, the primary fuel for heating and cooking and the primary form of energy for creating light in the dark has been light from a fire, or a few thousand years later, light from candles and oil lamps. Is it any wonder that the earliest forms of storytelling were epic songs, poems, and dances told and performed around an open fire? Quite often, when energy is defined in the modern era, we think in terms of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. So I'm arguing today that if we're going to think about culture and energy across time, we must broaden the range of what we think of as energy. And so here are the categories I want to sort of briefly introduce before we move to our panel. Energy for light, energy for heat, energy for cooking, energy for transportation, energy for industry, and energy for electricity. So my second argument is that all forms of culture require energy for their production, dissemination, and consumption. To create books, we need heat, light, today a computer. We need the energy that fuels the factory that makes paper, prints the words, and binds the book. We also need the energy that fuels the shipping of the book. And we need heat and light to make ourselves comfortable while we read. My third argument is that culture is often engaged in the project of representation, of telling stories about forms of energy. Many of our folk tales, for example, take place in the woods, where for nearly 1 million years, humans had to forage for their most important form of fuel, firewood. So I'm just going to zoom us through some of the history connected to these different forms. In 70,000 BC, we see the invention of the primitive oil lamp that was usually made of stone and burned animal fat. 29,000 BC, we have the earliest earth ovens. 8,000 BC, we have the earliest evidence of the pressing and use of olive oil, which was used for cooking and lighting. 3,500 BC, the first domestication of horses and the invention of the wheel. 3,000 BC, we have the earliest known sailing vessels. 2,000 BC is we find that the Chinese were the first to use coal as an energy source. By 1300 BC, it is common for homes in Greece to have a central hearth. And here is a Turkish king who installed radiant heating in his castle. 500 to 200 BC, we have developments in lamp and candle making. 200 BC, Europeans harness water energy to power mills. In the 10th century, windmills were used in Persia. And in the early 1400s, the first cast iron stoves. In 1400s, the first chimneys. 1590s, the mastery of windmills by the Dutch. 1600s, the use of coal coke in England. So this really marks a break. I want to point out that for most of human history, firewood and animal fat, and olive oil were the primary things that were used to heat and light. And so 1600s, 1700s is the big break with coal. There's the increasing reliance on whale oil and lamps in this period. Coal becomes the dominant energy source. 1712, we have the steam engine, which allows us to pump water out of coal mines, which increases the extent to which we can mine and use coal. 1748, the first commercially produced coal in Richmond, Virginia, and this is Coal Hill in Pittsburgh. What is Coal Hill called today? Who knows? Mount Washington. 1790s, the beginning of gas lights. A steam engine was invented that could be used to heat homes. 1821, first natural gas well in the US. 1825, coal-powered trains. 1860, the first solar-powered system invented in France. 1863, invention of radiators. 1870, the early Standard Oil well. 1882, Edison's Pearl Street Power Station. 1892, the first geothermal system built in Boise, Idaho. Paris World's Fair features an engine that can run on peanut oil in 1900. 1901, the famous Lucas Gusher in Texas. 1902 is Spindle Top, Texas. This is basically a year later. You can see the growth in oil production. And so really here, at the end, I want to pause and wonder why at the end of the 1400s, there's a printing revolution. Was this made possible by advances in the quality of lamps and oil that gave writers, inventors, and printing press operators enough light and heat to do their work? It admittedly, however, the increasing cultural dominance of books coincides with the rise in Western technologies to extract and harness fossil fuels. We also have movable type invented in China, and here shows the European output of books by century. So again, I think that the kind of explosion in book technology goes with that sea change we see when we move to coal as our primary fuel. And I'll end with an example of how culture reflects trends in energy. I just want you to think about all the folk tales that take place in the woods. There's a famous Korean folk tale called The Woodcutter and the Fairy, a wish-granting tale. The plethora of woods are dangerous stories, from Robin Hood to Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel and Goldilocks, the Three Bears, and the most famous woodcutters in American history, the Tin Woodman and Paul Bunyan. So today, please join me in welcoming our panel that's going to think more about the connection between culture and energy. Jacob is up next. Thank you.
All right, so the short talk that I'm going to give today is called Energy Waste in the Public Eye, Using Art as Advocacy. And it's part of a dissertation that I'm working on that looks at various ways in which literary and visual arts talk about coal waste, use represent substances like slurry, ash, and acid mine drainage as a way of kind of thinking about the contemporary environmental issues related to coal. To say a bit more about just kind of where this project is coming from, and thinking about the way that we kind of think about climate change in culture, I've noticed two main tendencies in how we talk about these things. So the first is there's a tendency to kind of think in terms of global collectivity, that we all kind of share the same air, we all kind of are going to have to deal with the similar environmental problems. We all share the same, planet's finite resources. And this kind of coalesces in a concept that geologists have put forward called the Anthropocene, that kind of takes the recent history, or our history of fossil fuel use or just resource use in general, and marks a geological era where we can actually kind of read the human history and the geological record. So there's this one tendency that universalizes, and that kind of competes with a second kind of or overlapping tendency that looks very much at the individual. So when we think about the way in which we respond, everyday folks kind of can respond to an issue like climate change, we think about our individual choices as far as what cars we drive, what kind of what we buy at the supermarket. It kind of takes this global problem and turns it into something that's very much something that we can see in daily life. And so there's these two kind of overlapping tendencies that I've been thinking through. And what I've noticed is that there's the absence of kind of like the way in which regional histories or kind of specific areas have their own kind of stories about kind of fossil fuel use, resource use that are just as much kind of should be a part of the way that we think about these more global issues in the present. So what I'm going to do is just kind of talk through a few artworks by one particular artist that I'm writing about right now. This is kind of an example that I thought was has a pretty good kind of illustration of some of the neat kind of technical techniques that artists are using. So this is by the artist John Sabarol. He's a painter from Southeast Ohio. And Sabarol has worked with an environmental engineer to develop a technique where they collect acid mine drainage out of waterways. They let materials settle, they spark certain chemical reactions that kind of reduce it down to iron oxide. They have purified water that then they put back into the stream where it came from, and then use the iron oxides to create pigments that are used in the art. So you can see a little bit just kind of about the process here. And so what Sabarol has done is he kind of has developed a certain technique where he lays out aluminum discs and then mixes this acid mine drainage-based pigments with water, and basically starts to kind of put the water on, drip the water onto the aluminum disc to where colors layer, and it creates kind of a bubble of water that then dries over the course of weeks to kind of leave this resulting artwork. And so we have an example of this here. And there's a way that his art kind of takes something that we would think of as an environment, or that's an environmental hazard, kind of by working through it, kind of creates these images that do have a certain extent of like kind of a natural beauty, especially kind of in this blues. It's something that is a much more kind of relatable in how we think about environmental art. You can see here as an example that's a little bit more cosmic in its colors. Okay. All right, so what I'm most interested in is how this art doesn't just kind of convey an environmental message. We don't get kind of much meaning by just looking at this art. But instead, I'm interested in how something like this or a series like this is an entry point into initiating a larger conversation about the environment. So in this case, what you have is this art that Sabarol creates these works of art, but also that these art, in the way that he talks about his art and the way he frames his art, it's all about the process. That this right here is just a tool that enables him to speak more about issues related to acid mine drainage. The ultimate goal that they're currently working on, I think they have a Kickstarter for this that's almost funded, is basically they're trying to work to create a large-scale plant to where they can continue to produce these paints at a commercial level, and then use the funds to further clean up acid mine drainage sites and things like that. So it's the art isn't the kind of the important thing here. It's how it opens up a conversation. On that note, I wanted to include these images here. These don't use the acid mine drainage pigments, but he has another series where he etches underground mine tunnels onto discs as a way of kind of getting people to talk about the way in which we've kind of recorded history underneath the surface, the way that we've kind of have these images that are kind of an artifact of the industrial era that we can talk about. I see this as part of a project that is both kind of helping us to think through some of the current environmental problems that are related to fossil fuel use, but also just kind of ways in which we can think about how culture can help us to think through some of the longer term ways in which we've used resources and have related to energy in our society. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about some of the how in energy humanities. I'm a historian, and I'm going to look at some of the materials that I can use as a historian to do the work of energy humanities, to think about humanities and also think about energy and the science and engineering of it at the same time. This is one example of knowing just enough about the language of science. I think it's really important to know what's going on inside the world of science and engineering, not to be a scientist or an engineer, but also to be able to use that language and to understand just enough to ask our own questions, our own humanities questions. So for example, in this diagram, which is a primary, secondary school diagram about the water cycle, we can see that groundwater is really an important part of the water cycle. Understanding some basic language and basic science of groundwater can help us to understand a community's relationship to fracking when perhaps one neighbor has signed a contract for fracking on their land and the other neighbor has not. So understanding those social and political and rhetorical dynamics at the same time that we understand the geological basis for disagreements and arguments. Another way that there's intersections between the work of energy, the science and engineering of energy and humanities is simply by using maps. Place and space, images and maps are really important for my discipline, history. Physical geography are, of course, really important for energy. Energy resources are situated in physical geography in the crust of the earth, whether it's coal and oil or shale, or whether it's uranium to propel nuclear reactors. People are also situated in geography. So a historian like me might ask about those people. Who are the workers on the oil rigs? Who are the coal miners? Who are the uranium miners? Who are the hydroelectric dam construction crews, and what's involved for the risks that they take? Another way of situating people in place and space is ethnography, so understanding people in their geographic situation. And my colleague Noah Terrio, who's an anthropologist, might talk a little bit more about this. The humanities give us a lens to understand relationships between people, place, and space. One way to do this is ethnography. So for example, I love this book by Mandana Limbert, who's an anthropologist. She went to the Sultanate of Oman, which is in the middle of an oil boom, and she wrote this book, The Time of Oil. And Limbert talks to everyday people in the Sultanate of Oman to find out how they understand their relationship to their new financial circumstances, how their life has changed socially as well as financially, their frontiers and their educations. But it also changes their understanding of the future itself. These people understand, everyday people understand that oil is not forever. So that is included in their understanding of the social and cultural world around them. A textbook I really like to use in teaching is this History of Engineers. I wind up teaching a lot of engineers, undergraduate engineers in my courses in history. And this author, Jessica Teisch, tracks the projects and the mindset of engineers who built California's infrastructures for water and mines and dams in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the author tracks those same exact engineers, the same people, as they traveled and designed big projects all over the world, for example, in Hawaii, in South Africa, and in Palestine. So this study is about expertise and the way that experts assume and implement their authority in engineering for energy projects. But for engineering students who read this kind of work, they wind up getting some context for how engineers did their work in the past. And they also get the social context that made a real difference. So they understand that the social assumptions, the social context, created a lot of the situations where engineers were asked to solve problems and to create new energy systems. And it leads to some reflection, usually, on the part of those undergraduate engineers about what they're going to do when they leave the university and when they become engineers out in the world. One way of talking about energy being situated in geography, in this case a hydroelectric dam, is that the power of the dam is directly related to the power of a river, which is a natural system. By studying a river and by studying the humans who have historically used, lived on, taken fish from, and understood the river in different ways, this particular study of the Columbia River is a classic river biography. There are many river biographies out there about many different rivers. And it puts dams like the Grand Coulee Dam and the Bonneville Dam in social, historical, and geographic perspective. Sometimes dams create beautiful archives. This film, Hydro, is part of the huge public excitement about the construction of dams from 1939, when people were really excited about electricity showing up in their homes and businesses. This dam video is available on YouTube. It was made public by some wonderful archivists of the Bonneville Power Administration, which is the administration that still manages the dams in the Columbia River. And this film, Hydro, is usually apparent to students who are savvy in the ways of propaganda and media as a propaganda film about creating a new energy installation. But at the same time, it's also a very beautiful film. It takes advantage of some of the best in the Works Progress Administration's film experts, and it has a full orchestral score. It's really beautiful and it's really compelling, and it reminds me of some of the stories that my own grandmother told me about how excited she was when electricity came to her rural home maybe 90 years ago. She's no longer around, but I remember her stories, and this film conveys some of that excitement. Digitized records are also the work of archivists. Archivists do really important work for historians like me, also for anthropologists and literary and cultural studies. They maintain documents and materials, and we live in this era when a lot of these archives are beautifully digitized and available to us who want to study them without having to travel, and without having to handle the documents with our own hands. So here we have some beautiful archives with illustrations of fish and canoes from the journeys of Lewis and Clark on that same Columbia River. And then sometimes archives give you these little gifts. This photo on the left is a photo that I found when I was doing research on a dam that was investigated by the World Bank, and the past director of the World Bank, Robert S. McNamara, had visited this dam, and I found this photograph, which I thought was really beautiful, of him overlooking the dam. The rest of the archives of the dam were quite boring. There were contracts and numbers and tables and memos that I had a hard time understanding. But then I saw Steven Spielberg's beautiful movie, The Post, about a particular moment in 1971, and I realized that the actor and the costume designer, the set designer, had done a really good job investigating what exactly Robert S. McNamara might have looked like, dressed like, and moved like in that era. So archives sometimes can give you gifts like that.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Noah Terrio from the CMU Department of History, and my talk is entitled From Standing Rock to Susquehanna, How the Environmental Humanities Can Illuminate the Politics of Energy. So thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Dr. Newman for organizing the panel, the Energy Week organizers for including us in the lineup, and also those whose labor keeps this campus clean, safe, and functioning day in and day out. I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which we're gathered today. For thousands of years, it's been the land of indigenous peoples, including peoples whose names have been lost to conscious memory, as well as to the Susquehanna, Haudenosaunee, and other nations at various points in time. Today, this region remains home to many indigenous persons from across Turtle Island, and I would like to express my gratitude to this land and its indigenous guardians for the opportunity to live, work, and form kindred here, even as I remain an uninvited guest. I wanted to begin today with a land acknowledgement, not only because it's important to recognize the settler colonial condition of our society, but also because it helps orient us to the perspective that the environmental humanities bring to conversations about energy. My aim today is to show why we need anthropology, history, and philosophy, and in particular, why we need the perspectives of indigenous scholars in these fields if we want to understand the disputes that surround energy extraction and transport in North America today. These disputes, I want to suggest, are about more than how the costs and benefits of particular projects or industries are distributed, and they're about more than climate change. To understand what's at stake and the seemingly irreconcilable struggles we're seeing in places like Standing Rock to our west and the Susquehanna Valley to our east, we need to sensitize ourselves to the historical, cultural, and ontological context in which these struggles unfold. Let's begin by considering a proposition that rose to prominence amid the struggle at Standing Rock. Water is life, a translation of the Lakota principle, Mini Wachoni. Although I cannot speak for Oceti-Sakowin water protectors or for any indigenous communities, I want to suggest that water is life is more than a protest slogan and more than a truism about the ubiquity of water as a necessity for life. It's an ontological proposition about the nature of being and about the distribution of life or vitality in the world. Only when we understand this proposition as such can we begin to fully appreciate what's at stake in resistance to energy projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline. As everyone here is surely aware, we live in a time of rapid, if volatile, expansion of oil and gas extraction in North America, from the tar sands in Canada to the shale plays of the US plains in the Northeast. Along with this comes an expansion of associated infrastructures, from the drilling rigs and the pipelines whose proliferation over vast areas is provoking intense controversy, to the adjacent industries like the ethane cracker being built about 150 miles to our east. Part of what makes these infrastructures controversial are the physical risks that they pose to the nearby communities, from those living in the so-called blast zones to those whose soil and water may be contaminated. Another controversial aspect, of course, is the connection to climate change, with many calling for a scaling down rather than an expansion of fossil fuel development. And yet another still is the question of property rights, with some landowners angered over the use of split estates, forced pooling, eminent domain, and other tactics to override their dissent. These are the sorts of concerns we are most likely to encounter in media accounts of what happened at Standing Rock. And all of these issues over physical security, health, regulatory fairness, and property rights should inform our understanding of what happened there. But what many media accounts and commentaries did not address is what, in my analysis, matters most: the long-standing struggle for indigenous sovereignty in response to violent colonial occupations and indigenous conceptions of personhood, kinship, and accountability that inform that struggle. In the case of Standing Rock, the Dakota Access Pipeline was more than a potentially hazardous infrastructure project. It was the latest chapter in a long story of dispossession and forced relocation, from the U.S. Army's 1863 massacre of Sioux persons at Whitestone Hill to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dam projects that altered sacred rivers and displaced communities in the 1950s. In the words of Oglala Lakota historian LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who founded the Sacred Stone Camp at Standing Rock, quote, "Where the Cannonball River joins the Missouri River at the site of our camp today, there used to be a whirlpool that created large spherical sandstone formations. The stones are not created anymore ever since the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredged the mouth of the Cannonball River and flooded the area in the late 1950s as they finished the Oahe Dam. They killed a portion of our sacred river." Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys-White adds that stopping DAPL was about stopping a vicious pattern of U.S. colonialism that inflicts immediate environmental harms and future climate change impacts on indigenous peoples, unquote. So we need to bear in mind the history behind all of this, and that's obviously something that the humanities can bring to the table. But we also need to understand what's at stake ontologically. In August 2016, Oglala Lakota scholar activist Ayuskin American Horse wrote, quote, "Our elders have told us that if the Zuzeka Sape, the black snake, comes across our land, our world will end. Zuzeka has come in the form of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and so I must fight," unquote. His invocation of the black snake points to the cosmological and ontological underpinnings of resistance to the pipeline. Calling themselves protectors and not protesters, the resistance by Ocheri-Sakowin and their allies cannot be reduced to a defense of nature in the Western sense of a pristine wilderness, nor to a protection of water as an inanimate object or resource, nor for that matter to a defense of territory. LaDonna Brave Bull Allard points out that the pipeline threatened to desecrate, quote, places held sacred not only by the Sioux nations, but also by the Arikara, the Mandan, and the Northern Cheyenne, unquote. This sacredness comes in part from the inhabitation of these places by divine beings. Writing of the philosophies of Great Plains nations, Blackfeet Métis scholar Rosalind Lapierre observes that, quote, the Blackfeet viewed water as a distinct place, a sacred place. It was the home of divine beings and divine animals who taught the Blackfeet religious rituals and moral restrictions on human behavior. It can, in fact, be compared to Mount Sinai of the Old Testament, which was viewed as holy ground and where God gave Moses the Ten Commandments, unquote. But this sacredness also comes from the role that these places play in maintaining kin relations that extend far beyond those one might have with one's living human kin. Linking the Standing Rock water protectors to the Idle No More and the Black Lives Matter movements, Dakota scholar Kim Tallbear describes all three of these movements as having been founded by, quote, badass women who caretake relations, unquote. The relations she's referring to are kin relations, but as a Dakota scholar, she uses kin in ways that contradict patriarchal white settler ideas of kinship, according to in her words. The kin in question are the spirits of ancestors, generations yet to be unborn, and other than human relatives of many different forms. So with all of this in mind, we can understand that resistance to the pipeline was, to a significant degree, about honoring these more than human kin relations and protecting them from an existential harm of cosmological proportions. It's worth recalling here that colonialism is not just a project of material, territorial, and ideological subjugation. It's also an ontological and cosmological project, one that seeks to subjugate and eliminate indigenous worlds. Tallbear further writes that in addition to the genocidal violence that settler colonialism has effected in North America, quote, another eliminatory tactic has been to sever our sustaining relations with our other than human relatives, unquote. Political theorist Audra Mitchell describes such acts of severance as transversal violence, suggesting how colonial projects involve not just physical coercion and erasure, but also the imposition of colonial temporalities, cosmologies, and ontologies. Time, being, and the cosmos itself are at stake. We can appreciate then that what was at stake at Standing Rock was also more than a culturally significant landscape. It was the very power to determine and enact what constitutes life. Elizabeth Povinelli describes this as Gianto power, which, she writes, operates through the regulation of the distinction between life and non-life. U.S. settler colonial society operates according to a secular biological conception of life and a human exceptionalist, possessive individualist conception of personhood, to say nothing of the racialized, heteropatriarchal structures through which these conceptions have been variegated. These conceptions fundamentally shape how our institutions function, and they fundamentally shape how we relate to one another, to other than human beings, and to the land itself. And these relations are fundamentally different from those that were being defended at Standing Rock. Life itself is what's at stake in the politics of energy today, and this is why water is life is much more than a slogan. This is a challenging proposition, but it's one that the environmental humanities can help us face. Thank you.
So we have a couple questions from the audience. This question, I think, could be answered by each of one of you to know your opinion. It says, what should scientists and engineers learn or apply from a humanities approach?
Well, I would say, along the lines of what I argued in my talk, that you can apply a sensitivity to the fact that different communities have very different worldviews oftentimes, and not just in terms of sort of surface level cultural differences that we're fairly familiar with, but sometimes at the very fundamental level of like different ontological assumptions about the composition of reality and the place of humans or sort of communities of beings in relation to their landscapes and to one another. So I think it's about cultural sensitivity and a sense that what's at stake is not just resources, but sometimes something like more intangible or difficult to measure, say, with the tools of economics or social sciences.
And agree to that. For example, 100 years ago, eugenics, the science of race and racial hierarchy, was taught in universities as a real science. This was 100 years ago, and there were engineers who were doing projects that were implementing these concepts, these social assumptions, at the same time that they were doing their dam construction or their community building or settlement building. And for engineers to learn about this, to learn that 100 years ago, engineers who were doing good work, solving engineering problems, were also reflecting and using and implementing these other social ideals is really powerful for engineers to learn about and to understand, because it makes them reflect on what might be the social context, what might be the social assumptions in their own time that they are reflecting and furthering without perhaps even realizing it.
Something that I'd like to add is just I think that something that the art that I look at kind of brings to the table is a way that kind of encouraging us to think at different time scales. So thinking both at, we think often about like what the life of a certain project might be. But something that I think is interesting about the acid mine drainage project in particular is how that brings together, a century, at least a century of resource use in the region. That it's something that we see this art that's based on this substance that's been in the process of being created for 100 years, and so not to mention coal itself. So we have just these ways in which these kind of objects, these cultural objects, can just help us think more thoroughly about time.
Yeah, I would add to that an observation about time. I think something that I found really humbling about thinking about the timeline of the relationship between culture and energy is how short the fossil fuel age has been. And while we're incredibly dependent on these technologies now, most of human history has been without the kind of resources we take for granted and that we are running out of. So a lot of our dystopian narratives imagine a world beyond fossil fuels, like Walking Dead. There's not a lot of electricity in Walking Dead, for example. So I just want us to be humble in our thinking about what is our right to these resources, and that we've had them for a very short time, and that we may not have them for much longer.
So the next question is related to this. How do we build curriculum to reflect this philosophy? Curriculum.
I think that providing accessible historical examples is one way to relate to humans in the past and see how we might be doing things differently or the same right now. It's a great awareness builder. I think history, I'm a historian, of course, is without parallel in that case. So I think that knowing how we got to where we are, and also being really conscious about where we're at and what our discussions for the future are, and seeing that, in fact, we are embedded in some social assumptions and some mindsets is really important. I also think that having language to cross disciplines is part of this. So for humanities, I think having the language of science as part of our discussion, not to be a scientist, is important. And I think the same for science and engineering, having the language of humanities, understanding what a close reading is, what a critical reading is, what an image analysis is, what a social analysis is. I think that all of this is really important. So getting some of each and each.
Yeah, and on that note, I also think that issues like energy and the environment are something that cuts across disciplines so well that it enables students to kind of not just think about their their immediate work, but to how their work connects to a range of disciplines and how they can draw from that. So in teaching first-year writing classes based on some of these topics, it's interesting to see folks who might not enter into the semester wanting to think about social problems at all, walk away understanding the way in which engineering is very much connected to these decisions we make as a society as far as how we use resources. So it's a way that we can just kind of, as Abigail said, have that common language that we can connect all of these different approaches to problems together. And then the next class I'm teaching is on waste, and so that's again something that's very much a cultural object that we see in our everyday lives, that touches on design, on engineering, on all of these kind of problems. So it's again this common symbol, this common something that allows us all to come together to think about broader environmental issues.
I'll just talk very briefly about a class that I teach called Environmental Literature. It's a 19th century literature class. And I make the students go on 5 nature walks during the course, and the walk has to be at least an hour, and they can't bring technology on their walk. And students have told me it's the hardest assignment they've ever been given at Carnegie Mellon. So I think what we're all trying to do is really kind of peel things back and take students, just kind of remove, again, some of the things we've become dependent upon to think about what was Thoreau's experience. And even if we can't recreate it, what would it mean to be without our technology for an hour?
Thank you very much to our panelists. A fascinating talk. Thank you. So we have actually reached our first break of the day. It's lunchtime. So what we're going to do is, you all are currently in Rangos 1 and 2. Directly behind that wall is Rangos 3, and that is where lunch is. So the way that we do this is we go out these 2 doors to the side, back into Rangos 3. There are buffet lines. So pick up your lunch, bring it back with you, and we will get started promptly at 11:45. 11:45. So we'll see you in less than 30 minutes. Thank you.
gonna disconnect this temporarily.
Yeah, no, good.
So, oopsie. So you're gonna, with your clicker, you're
Yeah.
gonna move it,
Yep.
and if you move the mouse, you're gonna see the play. And you just
Click it. Click it there or click it there?
click it here or click it here.
Go one.
Here. So you have to move the
You
mouse.
have to move it to get it, and then.
Yeah.
So hang on, go down there, and then what am I clicking there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Okay, there's a delay, and then okay, and then this is moving screens.
So I'm gonna connect you again.
So I go 1, 2, there. Click it. Okay, wheel is changing.
Confidence monitor's not working. Because when you connect it, oh, okay, but then it will. Okay, I was just checking. I'm sorry for a minute.
Perfect.
Okay. Can
Do
I
you-
put
so-
this box down? or
I was
do
gonna
put
just
that
put
I
it.
can
I'll
hold
put
it
it down
for
there.
you.
I'm gonna put it all down there.
up? Just steal that. Just steal this.
I have all your stuff.
Actually, sorry, there's one more piece of paper there.
We need to put you backstage so the magic is happening.
Yes. Thank you so much. We're all set?
Yeah, we should be.
So everyone, we're going to get started in about 2 minutes. So if you'll take your seats, we're going to get started in about 2 minutes. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Siefkin. I'm the Associate Director for Innovation and Strategic Partnerships for the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. We are very glad to have you here for this lunchtime lecture. I am not doing the formal introduction today, but I am here for a bit of housekeeping. In front of you on the table, you'll actually see a note about a website that we're using to collect questions. So if you have a question for for either our speaker or our moderator, you can certainly put that information. You put slido.com into your browser. You put in the code #CMU Energy, which is the same as all of our social media in the case you're doing that today. And the questions will come to the moderator on stage. So with that, I'd like to introduce Christine Mondor. She is a CMU alum, a CMU adjunct professor, and she's also the principal and co-founder of Evolve EA, which is an architecture and planning firm here in Pittsburgh. Thank you, Christine.
Thanks, Anna. So I have the pleasure today of introducing the CEO of Philips Lighting, Chris White, and come on out. If I can tell you a little bit about Chris. Exactly. Look, I lift up the thing and out he comes. Chris White is the fairly recently named president of the Americas for Philips Lighting, and he's responsible for accelerating the company's leadership position and expanding the role of the region as a critical hub of economic growth and innovation. If I understand correctly, you manage all commercial and operational activities across the company's entire portfolio, from conventional and LED products to connected systems and services, and to advance the success of Philips in North, South, and Central America, big region. It is. You are a recognized thought leader on the positive disruptive effects on the increasingly digital and connected world. Chris has done a TED talk online, I recommend. And he brings a unique perspective to the Internet of Things, which is helping the company further expand its connected lighting offerings. Chris has held a number of transformative executive roles throughout his career. Prior to joining Philips Lighting, he was a 20-year veteran of Cisco, where he held various leadership roles, including Senior Vice President of Global Sales Strategy and Go-to-Market. The Internet of Things, where he spearheaded Cisco's market influence and leadership in IoT. And before that, he was the general manager of the Sports and Entertainment Group, which under his leadership grew from a $20 million company to a $500 million business in less than 5 years. So with that, let's hear from Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, and great to see everybody. It's an amazing experience to be here at Carnegie Mellon. Thank you for that great introduction. It's always, as I hear your bio, I'm like, is that really me? I'm like, so hopefully I can live up to that expectation. So in the next 15 minutes, my objective is to hopefully change your perspective of light. And one kind of corny way I could do it is turn the lights off and do this presentation in the dark and share the value of light, but I think you all get that. But light and the whole lighting industry is going through yet another amazing transformational journey. A lot of people get the fact that old incandescent lighting, that Philips has been a pioneer and innovator for over 120 years in, has gone through its first major transition going to LED lights. And most of us see the value and understand what LEDs can do for us from a longevity perspective and a quality of light. However, now that entire ecosystem is being connected. And for someone that has been in the industry in the world of IoT for the last couple of years, some of you probably know some of the predictions already. We all feel fairly connected to the internet today. However, the predictions are 20 billion, 50 billion, maybe 200 billion things are being connected to the internet over the next 3 to 5 years. And on the one hand, that sounds crazy amazing, and that, is that even possible? But then every day in taxi cabs around the world and conversations over dinner, My son has a connected basketball. My father-in-law has connected hearing aids. We all have connected thermostats. Many of you hopefully have connected lighting at your home through our Success in the Consumer channel with the Hue product, which is the #1 connected product around Alexa as an example, so voice-activated lighting. But I want to give you a lighting tour here of the lighting world as is today. I want to share with you some of the innovation of the future. And I do want to achieve two things. One, get you thinking differently about light. But I also would challenge you all to start acting differently about light. Because if we're really going to all take advantage of this thing called IoT or digitization or connected lighting, we've got to do certain things a little differently. And as you go through this presentation and as we get into the Q&A, hopefully you'll kind of be thinking about that and, as we turn this into a discussion, not just a one-way conversation. But a couple of data points, right? Light, it's an interesting dilemma. So light is a major consumption of power around the world, probably the largest. 18% of the world's energy is consumed through light sources. So there's a huge amount of pressure to reduce the amount of energy that light consumes, yet there is exponential demand for light, right? So the predictions is as the population of this planet grows, there's actually one sobering data point, there's 1.2 billion people that don't have access to regular energy or light sources. So there's a huge demand just there, but as the whole world urbanizes, we're looking at more and more light sources hitting the world. So therefore, thinking through the energy implications, the social implications, the building implications are not to be underestimated. This is a little bit of, I'm an ex-Brit, I'm an ex-Californian, I'm moving to the East Coast with Philips Lighting. This, I don't know, anyone recognize where that bridge is around the world? Any Californians in the room? Bay Bridge, thank you. That is the Bay Bridge that got lit up, actually, interestingly enough, through my background with a Cisco data center and a Philips Lighting infrastructure. On the one hand, got phenomenal recognition, great lighting up another iconic tourist place. But also there was a little bit of anxiety in that community as well. You know, there's homeless people in San Francisco. There are some urban issues in San Francisco. Should you be investing in a tourist area? So what we did was partner with the city and actually SAP and have come up with a social media tracking device on this device. So the city can actually see how many tweets, Instagram, social media images or activations are used both in a positive light and a negative light. Are people tweeting that says, what a waste of money and this is terrible? Or are they taking photos saying, oh my God, what a beautiful icon, I'm going to come back to San Francisco? And thank goodness the positive feedback has been very good, and they're using that as a way to help understand how they can connect with the community, understand what tourism needs are for the future. But it's just an example of the idea of just lighting a structure up is pretty cool. Understanding what impact it has on society or a community, let alone the economics of a community, hopefully is even more impactful and better. To get you a little excited and hopefully to let lunch digest a little bit, I want to share with you a little bit of a video. We're so excited at this digital transformation, we're actually going to change the name of our company next month. And this is a bit of a teaser on that with regard to, if I can get the video, okay, she told me, that's it. The wiggle the finger. No, I got that. I missed the wiggle the finger piece. I got it. Okay, so hopefully the audio will come through. I just want to play this very short video that will share with you a little bit of what the transformation is all about. One more time? Come on, I can do this. Wiggle your finger, press the play button. That's what I did. Thank you. It was the Philips people in the room that started clapping first, by the way. So it was, and just to clarify what that means, we're actually keeping our brand names. We're actually using the Philips brand in certain areas still, but from a company perspective, Philips Lighting spun off from Royal Philips. Almost its 2-year anniversary is coming up next month as an example. So we're the largest publicly traded lighting company in the world today. We've got a very 5% spend and investment on R&D. We believe the combination of innovation in lighting and combining that with the value and impact of connected lighting has tremendous impact on this world and in business in general. Hence the name change, which will become official next month after it goes through a little bit of European legislative issues. So let's talk about why our world is changing. And I think some of this is no surprise at all to this great audience here. Obviously, population growth means people need more light. There is also, though, a challenge of how much that resource is consuming. Therefore, how can you make it even more efficient and energy efficient and use less of the resources that are out there to make sure this planet keeps going? But then also there's the idea of what does digital innovation do to that? As things digitally go from analog to digital, I think we all know the rate of change changes dramatically. It's not just a linear change, it's an exponential change. And sometimes we all have trouble getting our heads around, probably not with this esteemed audience, but I do, thinking about how do you think and act exponentially? How do you plan for exponential change? Our architects, our design people, our buildings, our set, beautiful building just down the road is a multi-year process. By the time that building starts compared to when people walk into that building, the technology has changed dramatically. So how do we think differently and architect differently and collaborate differently to take advantage of that? I wanted to give you a few examples of that. Obviously, the population growth and urbanization with cities is putting a lot of pressure on city infrastructure. How could light and the light infrastructure help transform that? I know we have the mayor of San Juan here. I just had a meeting with her this morning. Phenomenal passion and desire to help get that community and that country out of the tough times it had after the hurricane. But she's also thinking through as a thought leader of how do you take advantage of that and put in a digital infrastructure? How do you put in a connected infrastructure that if that terrible accident happens again, how do you get back online quicker? How do you get lighting to communities quicker? How do you get power to communities quicker? How do you get food connected? So this whole idea of connecting communities that typically operate in silos is a great area. What we're excited about is think of the light infrastructure both inside a building and outside the building. I spent 20 years at a networking company that was pretty proud of plumbing the internet and putting together the first generation of the internet and the great impact that had. Think now of the next generation, whether you call it IoT or digitization, the need for connecting the world. With 5G technology that the telcos and some people are excited about, I know some people are a little nervous about that, 5G as an example needs 10 times the density of cell towers than the current cellular technology. So think about the impact that might have on a beautiful campus like this. Do you want to see 10 times the amount of ugly cell towers designed as poor imitations of plastic trees around this campus as an example? And what we've tried to do is innovate and partner with other private entities, and we've announced a partnership with this company called ATC, American Tower Corporation. American Tower Corporation, their last business model was designing those ugly towers, but typically they're in areas that not many people see. We've now designed a light pole that actually can be beautifully architecturally designed, but you can open that light bulb up and put 5G antennas or low-band IoT internet towers or Wi-Fi antennas into the structure and therefore cover the area without impacting the community, etc. The efficiency side obviously is doing. Philips ourselves, we have shipped 2 billion LED light sources already. And that's made a difference, but then there are certain consumption issues or infrastructure issues that how do you keep going? And how do you actually get to that next generation of what connecting light can really be all about? And how do you make an even bigger impact with that? So I wanted to kind of share with you some examples of what digital innovation is already happening. And I want to finish on hopefully stretching your thoughts about future waves of innovation that candidly we haven't even figured out how to implement and benefit from yet. So let's start at the home. Anyone here have a connected lighting system in their home today? few early adopters in the room. That's good to hear, right? And the idea of connected lighting and connected home, right? It's not actually new, right? The smart home has been talked about for decades, right? Sony and Panasonics of this world, a couple of decades ago got all excited about it, and technology wasn't together. Then the home networking market that I was a part of a couple of years ago got all excited about it. But now, with things like Alexa and Nest's thermostat and connected lighting, it's becoming a reality. You can actually use your cell phone device to control your home. And I want to kind of stretch your thinking a little bit, because some people in the audience are probably sitting there saying, seriously, you need a connected light bulb? You can't get up and turn the light switch on and off? But there are multiple benefits of a connected lighting system in the home. One actually is safety and security. If you think about it, right, how many people have tried that gorgeous system of getting one of those timers in your wall and putting a thing when you go on vacation, right? I got a news flash, right? The criminal world has figured out, if they sit outside your house for 2 days in a row and that light bulb just goes on and off, you're not home, right? So the idea with a connected system is, why not mimic it the way you live in that home? So set a pattern that says, when I come home, the lights in the kitchen go on because I'm making dinner. Then I'm going to go to the front room and watch TV for an hour, and then that light's going to go off, and then I'm going to the bedroom for half an hour, and I'm in bed. And it gives the impression of a more secure, livable room. Think about any one of us that have elderly parents. If you could help control the lighting environment, so as it gets dark, you can turn the lights on for your elderly relations and improve the environment they live in. The idea of this has gone into the hospitality area, right? Anyone that travels around the world, one of the worst things is to get up in the middle of the night, hit the light switch, and be blinded and woken up when you're trying to just survive through the night and get as much sleep as possible. Well, certain new hotels are putting sensors in the room now, so as you get up, a dull light comes on, you can go to the bathroom, you can turn the lights, air conditioning up or down, you go back to bed and relax. So the spectrum is huge. The other end, for any entertainment, any sort of Netflix junkies, any movie buffs in the room? So we demonstrated at CES where this can connect to your entertainment system. So the idea is, pick your favorite movie. You're going to watch a movie, right? You dull the lights. Most people now have got these beautiful TVs with surround sound systems. What if the lighting system interacted with that movie? What if, we demonstrated this with Wonder Woman, right? You're sitting in a dark room watching a movie. As an explosion goes off, all your lights go on as well. The immersive experience is incredible. Any music people, if you're listening to your favorite band in a concert, the light show in your house is exactly the same as what is going on in stage. So there's these two huge extremes. There's a very pragmatic, practical example, and then there's this very inspirational, immersive entertainment value. But let's bring it back into the business world and into buildings like this. This is Deloitte's corporate headquarters in the Benelux, actually, and talks about a connected lighting system. But they didn't just connect the light system, they gave every employee an app to be able to control that system. So you can control the lighting or in the environment, and this has proved to be one of the most sustainable buildings in Europe. It's also proved to be one of the most efficient buildings in Europe, and people like the environment because you can adjust the lighting to increase the energy level and increase the productivity of people in that area. City of LA went to a connected lighting system, have seen a 10% reduction in crime. Because guess what? Crime happens in dark, unsecure neighborhoods. So if you can increase the lighting area in the cities, things improve. Huntington Beach is an early pioneer. This is one of those light poles that I talked about before, right? Embedded in that light bulb is a 5G antenna, a Wi-Fi antenna, a shot detection antenna, an environmental antenna to create a better environment in a community. To finish on a little bit, to think a little bit different and some of the future technologies. So solar-powered light, we've worked with areas in India, in some of the light-starved villages, so kids can do their homework at night. We've actually worked down in South America to provide light to stadiums so kids can play soccer in the evenings. There's this great technology we just showed last week at Light and Build, or 2 weeks ago, called Li-Fi. Li-Fi uses the power of light to distribute the internet. At the moment, it's being demonstrated at a 30 to 40 megabyte pace, so the idea of that light source delivers Wi-Fi and data to that table. It doesn't distribute it everywhere, so it's very secure, it's very focused. Future technologies on infrared say that could be up to 3 gigabits type of transmission. But also, with this lighting infrastructure, you should be able to tell how many people are in this room, what they're doing, link in with the infrastructure to adjust the air conditioning. As a retailer, you can figure out where you are in the store and deliver 30-centimeter location accuracy using light versus other technologies. And then the other thing we've got to do, where I'll finish on, is we have to feed this world. So light sources and the way we use horticultural lighting to make things grow as efficiently and as effectively as possible, hopefully allows us to feed the world as well. So in that lightning session there, I know we want to turn this into an interactive session, so I'll come join you on the couch. Thank you for listening. Hopefully you do think of lighting a little bit differently, and I'll come join you. Where do you want to sit? Right here?
Okay, see?
Great.
Great. All right, well, let's give him a hand first.
Great. Thank you.
So I get to pick your brain a little bit, and so I'm going to ask you.
There's not much there, so be careful. It should be a short session. There.
Okay, that's great. We're done. I am going to ask you some questions about how Philips is thinking about these things, not just from a product aspect, but also from how you do business.
Yep.
Connect it back to how the university connects, and then talk about kind of how this scales in the future. So first, we've heard some interesting ideas about change models. In the past presentations yesterday and the day before, I'd say if I had to paraphrase how people talked about it, some people talked about their companies as kind of virtuous innovators. Yep. Other ones are profit-driven implementers. Crisis disruption is another model of change. Code-driven change. There's a number of different ways that companies are thinking about, or researchers are thinking about how their offerings are going to be taken up in the market. Where does Philips fit in this continuum, and how do you all think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually I think it's the right question too, because being a publicly traded company now, there are certain pressures on you to deliver results and continue to be successful. But hopefully that doesn't distract you from your core values and your core focus. Mm-hmm. And one of Philips Lighting's core values and focus is innovation in lighting and the benefit of lighting. Mm-hmm. And so I'm actually pretty proud, and I've only been here 90 days type thing, but the balance seems to be a very good one. And hopefully the pressure of being a private sector company can put the right sort of pressure on the innovation engine. Mm-hmm. Because more and more that innovation needs to be aligned with the needs of a community or the business, otherwise it's not commercially viable.
Yeah.
So I think hopefully we've got a pretty good balance on that. We don't want to just innovate for innovation's sake. Yeah. But we're trying to make sure it's a benefit to the planet and the commercial side as well as the educational side.
So if your change model is connected to both community and to product innovation and to profit, obviously, as well. How is that happening internal? And I'll say one of the great things about Carnegie Mellon is that we have people from all different disciplines. I'm an architect and designer and thinking about how people make urban environments. But I was talking to one of my colleagues 10 years ago who was working in materials science, and she's talking about boy, we need to get to this point before these cool things she's doing, which eventually led to LED, yep. Just weren't there yet. And so we recognized there was a gap between where we were here. Philips is kind of the organization right now that's filling that gap, right, between material science and implementation. Who is on the team in Philips? What kind of thinking are you doing? How is this different than your traditional model of doing business? Because you're selling your bulbs in a computer store, not in a hardware store.
Yep, so. Yep. No, boy, there's multi-dimensions to that question, and it's a great one. I think one, if you look at the internal side of a company like Philips, we now have multiple layers of where we both innovate and interact with the market. Mm-hmm. And this is why I love doing events like this, right? The challenge to think differently and keep up to date with amazing institutes like this as far as how much outreach they want to do, how much private partnerships do you want to really roll your sleeves up in doing. But, with regard to Philips, though, we have, a chief innovation officer that is looking a little further out, looking all around the world, in China, in India, in the US, in Europe, to figure out what are some of the new technologies and disruptive factors that are happening, whether it be in lighting innovation or chip innovation or artificial intelligence or robotic implementation, right? Those are colliding. When it comes to a regional basis, we try and roll our sleeves up with both customers, education, and again, an innovation engine, whether it be the startup community that got very well profiled here this week, and make sure we're not missing anything. And so the multi-dimensions now, we want to make sure we're not so proud of our heritage and innovation that we get stuck into the good old not invented here syndrome. But then, you know, it's a very, very, very careful balance, actually, I think, nowadays. But what I've comfortable with, and one of the reasons I joined the company is I like the idea of, you know, let's stick to our knitting, so to speak, and realize there's so much innovation going on in lighting and disruption going on there. And then let's not be naive to what digital disruption does. So therefore, as an example, we've launched an IoT platform with open APIs to other people so they can, you know, plug into that community. And both, by the way, on the corporate side as well as the home side. So we have a whole developer community called Friends of Hue that can come up with cool applications to use lighting that, you know, we would never have come up with without that ecosystem and community.
Yeah, so you really need to create that ecosystem to support your product, which is so much more complex than when it was just providing lighting.
It is, and I want to bring up one other point because I think it's a very valid one, right? You know, lighting in a computing store, and one of our challenges as we move digitally is the consumption of lighting at the moment, because historically we typically would have gone to, you know, a major building supplier or you know, or standard electrical play, and all of a sudden it does need to be in a computerized environment. Take that into the business world and your background of design and architecture, right? It's like, okay, how do we talk differently to the architectural community and the design community to think differently about, you know, it's not just, you know, 6,000 light points in this room, right? What could you do with, you know, 8,000 connected ones that understand how it's linked to the heating system or the tracking system to get more efficiency and a better experience in a room like this?
Sure. So I think you did a great job, actually, of connecting to the urban environment. You know, we're not talking about just the technology, we're talking about the role of it within the environment. And another one of our assets here at CMU, Joel Tarr, has done studies on how lighting changed the way we behave in cities when we first got electrification. So that's a big difference. What do you see as the future? What's different in a city, not just visually, but performatively, because we're implementing new technologies?
Yeah, and there's multiple layers to that. And I think one of the things you just alluded to, and we've done some of our own research and partnered with some educational establishments around the world to understand the impact of light on our lives. And, you know, as an ex-Northern European that has the benefit of living in California for the last couple of years, I can just tell you personally, right? You know, you wake up in dreary, wet old England and...
It's never like that here. It's never like that here.
It's a nice day today.
Yeah.
I enjoyed my drive here this morning.
Always like that.
But, you know, contrast that to being, you know, vitamin D overdosed in California. You know, you wake up with an energy, right? So think about, to your point, okay, if you don't have the benefit of good old California weather, how can you use light to change that environment? And literally, we've done studies, and now some of our connected lighting will literally do that, right? So, and we're actually trying to figure out what the transition from getting up in the morning all the way to going to work is. So our Hue system has been designed to be bright and energizing when you wake up, to be relaxing when you come in, but to be intense enough if you want to read a good book. Take that into the business world for a minute, or the educational world for that matter. You know, we're probably all drinking a little too much caffeine nowadays to try and keep that energy going. Well, what about using light to stimulate and keep your brain and the you know, endorphins moving in the right direction? So I think that just moves into the community as well, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea of connected lighting in a city has multiple effects. One, bring light to impoverished areas, bring light efficiency by being able to control those lights, but don't do it at the expense of the experience. We had Cardiff City, a small city in South Wales, the capital actually, at our leadership conference a couple of weeks ago, and the gentleman was fantastic because he talked about the benefit of a connected light system that even he didn't understand. So the idea is we're trying to conserve energy, but if there's an accident, can you give police access to that system to turn up the lights to bring safety in, get people out, get the thing cleared up, and then drop it down again. You know, if you're at a restaurant at a, you know, having a nice dinner on your anniversary, you don't want a light just going in there. So they've given retail establishments access to the lighting, so they can dull it during their peak hours, but then when they want to get everyone home safely, they turn it up brightly again and people get out of that city. So I think there's really interesting sort of community benefits and impacts. And the one final one I'll talk about, which I didn't even think about, is the benefit of light to the deaf and blind community. People in Cardiff go down the pub and have a drink. If they're using sign language, they can communicate in an environment like that. As soon as they walk out and there's bad light, they can't.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, blind people, they don't need light, but their guide dogs need light to be safe to take them home. So it's just a fascinating example of what connected lighting has multiple benefits in a community.
So that makes me think about how important it is here in the university that we already do a good job working across units. And I'm reminded that our colleagues that came up just before this presentation were from the humanities. And you know, you heard more than once that part of their role is understanding how this is situated in the cultural, ethical matrix of things. We're technological optimists. You're a technological optimist. What concerns or worries or challenges do you think we have with, as we're so optimistic about adopting new technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're just having this conversation on the walk over, actually, because I class myself as a digital optimist. I'll put an unplugged plug-in for a gentleman that I don't know that well, but Peter Diamandis wrote this book, Abundance. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called The Future is Brighter Than You Think. Nothing to do with lighting at all, by the way.
Why you like it.
But it just talks about digital adoption solving some of these things we worry about. So I think one, digital optimists shouldn't be naive to digital implementation. Because if there's one thing that does slow the benefits of digital, it is the adoption. And again, I'll pick on your background because you know it very well, right? You know, the design and build infrastructure business runs with a certain cadence and a certain dynamic. We touched on before this about, if someone's building this and you guys say, okay, I need 100 lights in this light bulb, there's pressure on that building project to do it at the most cost-effective area. So if you're not careful, the value of connected lighting suddenly goes out the window. We also talked about a little bit of the challenges of some of these low-cost imports coming in, and are they really delivering the value that people think? As consumers, we're very price conscious. You could argue that's what made Walmart so successful, right? The best product at the right price, in the right location. But you've got to be careful, is the value really in that? My father-in-law, before I even joined Philips Lighting, offered to upgrade my lighting system at my home and in my landscaping, and I was thrilled. God bless him, he got online, he did all this research, all these boxes started showing up, did the whole thing. Less than a year later, 50% of those lights don't work.
Yep.
So thinking through that whole value proposition, I think, so the implementation side and really understanding the value, and therefore the idea of collaborating across silos is something that should not be underestimated. That is easier said than done.
Absolutely agree. So we now have time for questions from the audience, and I know that you can text them in. The instructions are on your tabletop. So you open up a website and then you just ask your questions. And Anna, you've been monitoring those questions. What do you want to throw our way?
We have a lot of questions coming our way,
great.
just so that you know. And I want to apologize in advance. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but wanted to let you know that. So a question about privacy. So does the idea of connectivity also push the idea of increased protection of privacy? And how are innovative companies like Philips thinking about this issue?
A very excellent topic and fairly topical in the news this week with Mr. Zuckerberg and what Facebook are doing. And it's interesting, I had a whiteboard session with the mayor of San Juan this morning, and she just passionately was drawing up what she needs from a new infrastructure. And two parts of the conversation which I thought were fascinating was, one, how do we make it all digital? But then the immediate follow-on question needs to be, how do you make it securely digital? And if we're not careful, we are putting digital solutions all over the place, and security is a little bit of an afterthought, and we don't really stress test the security of those. So one, it's security as a fundamental, and two, candidly, I think digital optimists shouldn't get carried away with themselves. They've got to understand the community that they're talking to and addressing, and privacy, security concerns, they're real issues. But I think we've got to create the right balance. The analogy I always use is, people used to walk in front of the automobile with a flag slowing it down as well, right? We eventually got comfortable with the automobile and decided to put speed limits on freeways. So there's sort of an adoption process we need to think through. I know you've got a lot of questions, so I'll try and make the answers quicker.
So I know that you and the mayor of San Juan talked about Li-Fi, which shows a lot of promise. So does Philips have plans to work with the device market, laptops and phones, to integrate Li-Fi hardware in their products?
I think the quick answer is yes. And obviously we're excited about the future opportunity. We also feel you've got to be careful with some of these new technologies. They're not a panacea to every connectivity issue. What you're seeing now with Li-Fi, with next generation Wi-Fi, narrowband, IoT, Bluetooth, Zigbee, there's multiple connectivity options now. So you've got to just think through where is that best suited to the best use case.
Next question. Can you talk about energy for enabling the computing? This person is worried that all of the energy gains that we've gotten from switching to LEDs would get lost in the race to remain connected.
That's an excellent question, and I think this is where not just the design community, but the user community, the people that operate these things, need to be thinking it through. However, even with LED technology, we haven't really implemented a tremendous amount of sensor technology. So, even LEDs can get left on. And so I think the combination of a correctly architectured digital environment with the right amount of sensors can hopefully stay ahead of that curve.
Great. So, next question. As the developing world grows, what are the challenges Philips sees in the future of the lighting industry?
Boy, that's a good one. Challenges in the lighting industry specifically. One, lighting, like many industries, always has a pressure of commoditization. And I touched on it earlier, right? The low pressure point of cost, you've got to think through not cost but value. So on the one hand, we are committed to the lamp business, the LED business. We're going to be in the lighting business for a long time. But we also recognize, in fact, we made an announcement just two weeks ago that our entire product line will be either connected or connectable within the next 3 to 5 years. So we believe the connected side is going to help us with the commodity side because of all the benefits we've talked about.
You mentioned that you are devoting 5% towards R&D. So how much of a commitment do you have with venture funding?
We don't actually publicly announce that, and actually the good news is it's a growing number, and as a public company, I think we're noticing, and conferences like this are great examples of realizing that startup community can help us move faster and cover more bases. So now we've got an active acquisition strategy, partnership strategy. I mentioned American Towers. We actually have a partnership with my old company, Cisco. We're going to be announcing a number of other companies. So you touched on this ecosystem play. I think the good news is Philips is pretty grounded in realizing we're going to do lighting and connected lighting very well, but it is going to take a proverbial village to deliver all these benefits.
So related to that, what would you like to see as signifies unique innovation 50 years from now?
Oh.
Hard questions.
It's a great question. It's a really thought-provoking question. When people ask me questions like that, I actually have a sort of an immediate pragmatic swing back to if we could just deliver what we're all talking about, that makes this world incredibly safe, incredibly connected. Hopefully, we can feed everyone, we can educate everyone. And so I don't think there's any magic bullet behind that. I think if we can just roll our sleeves up and get on and do some of the stuff that's already done, we could see fantastic, we don't have to wait 50 years for the benefit, we can get on with it.
So are you seeing an impact between light frequencies and health and motivational feeling?
So the quick answer is yes, and I touched on it before. There is definitely, well, it depends what the question is. So light frequencies and the impact of light. Obviously, how you use light, right? If we dulled this light down after lunch, it's probably not the best strategy from a meeting perspective. So trying to increase the light gradually, that doesn't scare us either. So there's definitely, and we're trying to figure out, again, how we work with the design community, the operating community to make that a reality. You can do it today, but we don't have the how many people have been in a meeting room with this beautiful, there's one right over there, right? Gorgeous control panel on the wall to do all these cool things. And it reminds me back, and I'll share my age here a little bit. It's good old VCR days, right? There's a VCR sitting on your TV and the light's flashing because no one knows how to program the damn little clock. I guarantee there's probably more power in that panel than in the space shuttle in Apollo 13, but can someone come in and help us use it type thing, right? So we've got to make it, I give Apple a lot of credit. That's why I'm a big fan of Apple's. No user manual, an app that makes it work. Hopefully we can adopt it and use the benefits more.
Anna, maybe I can just ask a question that I've had is what concerns do you have about the sunsetting of operating systems and being able to, if I switch my phone, if I switch my software, and I've got all my hardware connected to that, how do you future-proof against that?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I have the right answer, and I hope, especially my old tech industry, gets better and better at that, because on the one hand, it's easy for tech companies to go do it. In fact, there's a great one line. It's like, why was God ever able to build the world in 7 days? Oh, yeah. Because there was no infrastructure to upgrade. And it was, and I think tech companies kind of cheat a little bit to say, oh, forget that infrastructure, go with a new one, right? So I know we're getting a hook a little bit. Do you have one last question?
Just one last question.
Is that from you, though?
We have students in the room, so give us a couple of last thoughts for our students, your future employees. Tell us what you'd like for us to know.
Yeah, come join us and help, I think, is the quickest one. But in all seriousness,
That was the job offer.
No, hey, it's we need bright, smart minds. I just had a meeting down in Argentina with some of our early in career people, and my goodness, the passion, the energy, the openness to adopting future things versus, candidly, a lot of companies are like, well, we couldn't do that. We haven't done that for 100. We've done this the same way for 100 years. So, one, I think it's that. Two, think about the application of whatever you're studying and doing into whatever you're passionate about. The private sector, the public sector, philanthropic areas. Whether you're into engineering, computer science, humanities. Think about all the good stuff you learn. How can you take that out and make an impact? And don't let the company, including a Philips, suck that out of you and try and make you conform to the good old ways that it got done. We need bright, motivated people to help change the world and adopt this technology faster than we do it the normal way.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really good to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I know that we were so excited that you were able to join us. You're so new in your position, and we have a lot of lighting enthusiasts in the room who were so glad to see you here. So thank you again.
Appreciate it.
A bit of housekeeping for those of you who are still in the room. We're about to start parts of our Allegheny Clean Tech University Prize competition. But I do want to let you know that at 1:30, we have some tours that are happening. So if you are scheduled for a tour, the tours will be meeting at the registration desk at 1:30. But there are quite a few things that are happening between now and then, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew 1:30. The field trips will also meet outside to be walked over to the shuttle? They're meeting at the shuttle. So if you are going on one of the field trips that's in a shuttle, it will be outside. But again, this is in an hour at 1:30. Thank you. Wait. Oh, she's back. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jay Whitaker. Dr. Jay Whitaker is the director of the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation, who's going to be making our introductions for the afternoon.
Welcome. This is kind of a transition for Energy Week. We're now moving into the most excellent competition that is hopefully going to crown by the end of the day, a big winner. And it's a fairly intensive process that will last the next 5 or 6 hours, and we're super excited to kick it off. We have a very special guest here today who will be overseeing part and parcel of this competition. Her name is Jeanette Armstrong. She's a registered patent attorney and is the director of Department of Energy's Technology Transitions Office. Armstrong coordinates technology transition efforts across department-backed efforts, national laboratories, research facilities, and program offices, as well as oversees the Energy Investor Center and Technology Commercialization Fund. She also advises Energy Secretary Rick Perry on technology transfer and commercialization matters. Armstrong holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University, yay, and an MBA from Long Island University and a JD from Rutgers. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jeanette, who's going to give us some comments, and we will start this process. Thank you for coming.
Hello. Welcome to the Clean Tech University Prize Competition for the Allegheny region. It's sponsored by U.S. Department of Energy, and this competition is actually one of 8 regional competitions nationwide that will provide $50,000 prize. I'm happy to be here. As Jay announced, I am currently director of the Office of Tech Transitions at Department of Energy. And before I start, I thought I'll give a very quick snapshot of what DOE does and what Office of Tech Transition does at the DOE. DOE conducts basic research and applied research in diverse fields, very diverse fields, from nuclear physics to environmental science to batteries, nuclear weapons, renewable energy, supercomputing, for example. And DOE conducts these research through a network of 17 national labs. You might recognize some of the names, for example, Sandia, Lawrence Livermore, Los Alamos, Argonne, for example. So DOE invests very heavily in R&D, basic and applied, as I mentioned before. And DOE research accounts for 40% of DOE expenditures, which is over $30 billion per year. So within DOE, I head up the Office of Technology Transitions, which is OTT, we call OTT. It's a relatively new office. It was established in 2015. And we oversee and expand commercial impact of the investment that we make in R&D at DOE. So our goal is to improve and maximize accessibility of the national labs to increase the partnership between the industry and what's going on at the laboratories. Our office responsibly extends over DOE programs, 17 laboratories, and other research and facilities that's located throughout the country. So overview of the competition, teams, there are 4 states represented here today: Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Maryland. Top teams from this regional competition will go to the national competition and have an opportunity to win even more prizes, not only from Department of Energy, but Department of Defense as well. Winning teams will also receive additional business development and commercialization training and other education opportunities. This may not sound very important, but we have found that the commercialization training is actually very important as part of our R&D, because you can have the greatest innovation, but if you cannot market it and commercialize it and put it in a format that's accessible and interesting to the marketplace, you cannot promote your amazing innovation. So the details of the competition, there are 3 parts. First part, which will begin shortly, is a 1-minute elevator pitches. These pitches, along with, there will be e-poster sessions starting at 3:45 in the Danforth room, which will be selected as fan favorite. So in addition to 3 finalists, there will be another winner selected called fan favorite. So audience can participate in selecting these another team from the judging process. This is a link which you can type into any electronic device that you will have access to the form to pick your team that you like best. And then the top 3 teams will make their 10-minute pitches finals back in this room at 5 p.m. So with that, I'd like to invite our first team to come up and make their long 1-minute speech.
Yes, there's a permission needed on the floor. So hold on just 1 second.
Getting more than 1 minute.
I know.
An unfair advantage.
I feel like I should have had a routine for this. How's everyone doing today? I'll choose the first button.
Yeah, that's the wrong one. Okay, and then, hold on a second. Sorry, just, you can't show this.
Okay.
But I found it on my side.
Okay.
Okay, go back to the original, there you go. Okay, now everybody try again, please. Sorry about this, it's one of these weird Carnegie Mellon permission things. Does it work now? Success? Yes, okay.
Right. Did you vote for active charge? That's when you should vote for.
Okay, your 1 minute starts now.
Okay. I've been fascinated by renewable energy ever since I lived in the highlands of Guatemala. When I came back to the United States, I had the opportunity to visit a wind farm and was kind of struck by the sheer size of the blades. I mean, one blade spans the length of an entire football field. And I was wondering, how do these guys, these operators, know when a blade is wearing down or when it sustained damage? And I was surprised to find out that a couple of times a year, they'll send people up into the turbines, and they have to rappel down the blade and physically monitor the wind turbine blade to check for damage. And I thought, there's got to be a better way in this day and age. Now, remote sensing allows engineers safely on the ground to collect data multiple times a day. And active charge, our technology, takes that one step further by removing the need for batteries so that you can install the sensor inside of the turbine and collect data without any shutdowns of the turbine generation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Prince Ghosh, and I'm the founder and CEO of Boundary Labs. We're a startup spun out of research conducted at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, focused on commercializing our dielectric barrier discharge plasma actuator technology. Essentially, what we've created is a thin, flexible, solid-state electrode that can be applied in the form of a tape right to the surface of a wind turbine blade. When activated, our electrodes generate a thin layer of non-thermal plasma over the surface of the blade and control the air flowing around it with a series of electric fields. This yields an increase in aerodynamic efficiency and overall power output of the turbine by about 4%. We've tested benchtop scale tests at Case Western Reserve and are partnered with NASA Glenn Research Center in Cleveland, Ohio to conduct full-scale wind tunnel testing. I have a vision that one day every turbine in America is going to have our technology on it, pushing us one step closer to offsetting the effects of fossil fuels. Thank you so much for your time.
Good afternoon. I'm Nathaniel McLean from Coppin State University. Have you ever been caught at 3%? In today's day and age, we have a constant need to charge our portable devices. But the problem is, all these solutions are either bulky, expensive, or environmentally unfriendly. At Coppin State University, the Solar Tech team is using technology that can be integrated into backpacks, using natural dyes to generate power from sunlight. We're currently working with towing companies to get the technology into your backpack so that you can charge on the go. We're hoping to reach out to some 3,000 students at Coppin State University and expand to about 400,000 students in Maryland, to giving them the power to charge on the go, giving you an affordable, efficient, energy-friendly, environmentally friendly option that you can use on the go and stay in fashion. Thank you very much, Coppin State University.
What if I told you that this apple had the potential to be so much more than just trash? What if I told you that we had a system that could help solve this $160 billion food waste problem? Our seahorse system is the first of its kind that is easily deployable and can help restaurants profit off of two different types of revenue streams. The first is the clean energy that we can produce from their food waste, and the second is the fertilizer that we can give back to the communities. We have already raised over $100,000 within 1 year and have created Pittsburgh's first portable farming system. Additionally, we are launching our first prototype of our anaerobic digestion system in May and have been receiving interest from companies internationally. We're Ecotone Renewables, we are here to close the food loop, and we are creating a 21st century food system. Thank you.
So I want you to put yourself in the shoe of a scientist who's working at Philips, and as we now know with Synergy, and whose job is to design lights. Now when you're designing these lights, there are multiple design choices you can make, such as what materials do you want to use, what process conditions do you want to put them in, and eventually how do you assemble all of it together to suit your application. Unfortunately, the way many companies design lights, or batteries, or any other product for that matter, is actually a fairly painful process. They get hold of a scientist, ask them to analyze spreadsheets and spreadsheets of data to come up with a new design, test it out, and keep revising this for possibly hundreds of iterations until they find something that satisfies their needs. And this is a high-pressure situation to be in, especially if you know that fast innovation and discovery is what defines a success. And here's where we come in. At Experiment, we're a group of machine learning experts who have developed an AI platform that can choose better experiments to suit your needs and make this trial and error process more efficient. And while traditionally people tend to use software as a service or platform as a service as a business model for services like this, our goal is to develop a platform to develop, patent, and license our own designs. Thank you.
Everybody, we need to use the microphone because otherwise it's not recorded.
Hi, we are Gridfruit from Carnegie Mellon. In the US, there are more than 200,000 grocery stores, and they operate on razor-thin profit margins around 1%. That means today they're suffering as Amazon takes more and more market share. The supermarket's refrigerators alone take up to 20% of their potential profits. These refrigerators are gathering data from different components, but that data stays separate and never sees the light of day. At Gridfruit, we have an AI platform that takes this data, collects it, and applies our AI learning algorithms to provide the customers with optimal temperature set points and customized, tailored maintenance recommendations to reduce their costs by up to 15%. Now, these customers are generating over $1 trillion in revenue every year, and our market is $8 billion per year. We have one pilot going, 2 in the works. We're bringing AI to your grocery store. Thank you.
Imagine you're driving your shiny new electric vehicle, cruising across Allegheny County, but then when you see those red flashing danger lights flashing across your dashboard, low battery. Understandably, you'll be anxious. You want to find the next available charging station, but they're just not enough. Not one that's certainly available to your vehicle's remaining range. What do? This is where we bridge the gap. Hi, my name is Ashwin, and I'm from Omnitricity with Carnegie Mellon University. We work with residential, small commercial locations, and electric vehicle drivers in providing affordable, fast charging equipment that is compatible with any electric vehicle in today's market. We are a sharing economy business model that enables hosts to basically share their chargers for any other electric vehicle to come and charge. We are Omnitricity, and we make sure that your electric vehicle travel is a lot less anxious. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
There we go. Okay, so my name is David Smith, and I'm here representing West Virginia University and Squareline Power. Squareline Power's mission is to provide safe, durable solutions to the modern electrical problems we have this day. Using that, doing inductive charging power, using wireless power. In our first application, we look to target the 30,000 new internet cafes that have been open in the last 15 years. With that, using furniture to charge the laptops and cell phones that you all use and I use while I sit there and not buy anything in the coffee shops, to make it so that every 30 minutes you charge per 50 cents or $1 or something like that, to be able to make, they have recurring cash flows whenever it comes to the business. Second phase is to move on to drone charging. So, thank you. The law enforcement can make it so that the cutoff for the unplugging of the drones end up so that they save countless time for emergencies. Thank you very much.
Poop is a serious problem, and it's an especially big problem when it comes to water conservation, energy, and health. The standard toilet uses 6 liters per flush, and when that scales up, that means that we're flushing away 100 billion liters of water every day. Reducing the toilet's water footprint would lead to lower energy bills, lower water bills, and less wasted water. But conventional toilet surfaces need water to prevent fouling and foul odors and bacteria accumulation. So to lower the water footprint of the toilet while also maintaining a clean toilet experience, we've developed a sprayable surface coating that can repel liquids, solid waste, and also bacteria. Any residue left behind on our surface can be washed away with 90% less water than a conventional toilet surface. Our ultimate goal is to revolutionize the way that waste is managed, and perhaps with a coating like ours, one day toilets will be able to keep themselves clean while also reducing their environmental impact. Thank you.
Conventional energy sources are dying causes and have left in their wake pressing environmental health issues and expensive removals of hazardous waste. To combat these, we propose the advancement of a new sector of renewable energy, plant-generated electricity. We give you ZenCharge, an idea that employs the multifaceted applications of the generation of electricity through plants. With carbon electrodes and a power harvester attached to a constructed array of plants, we can now use the very nature we are trying to preserve to supplement our electricity needs 24/7. In particular, our latest innovative focus at ZenCharge involves an electricity-producing green wall, the utilization of a revolutionary, all-inclusive technology safeguarding our power and our Earth. This is ZenCharge. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tim. I am from HEC, Greenhawks Compact Composter. The problem that we have today is many residential areas produce about 4 pounds of compostable waste each day, but most residential areas do not have composters that can meet their demands, especially ones that are automatic. They're not there. Our goal at HEC Greenhawks is to create a composter that can automatically biodegrade the matter quicker and faster without the need for manual labor of having to continuously turn it and add water. This will automatically do all this for you. Thank you.
Thank you, all the team members. Thank you for coming up. Just figuring out what you have to say in 1 minute, that's really difficult. So now, audience, please remember to vote for your favorite team so they can, another team can have an award. Also, at 3:45 is when the poster session is. Please, this is way too short for you to figure out a little more about what's going on with this great innovation have been discussed here. Please start by at 3:45. Stanford room, which is just past the fast food place on this floor, to talk to the team members and ask about the innovations. And please return here at 5 o'clock to see who won the $50,000 award. Thank you, panelists.